Bach's Prelude in E-flat major from Book I of the Well-Tempered Clavier is always considered to be rather special. Partly that's because it's the first large-scale prelude we've heard in the collection. Up until this point, we've had what are essentially a series of etudes for the keyboard. Think, for example, how we started out with the C major prelude with its gently flowing arpeggios. The C minor prelude, the C sharp major prelude, the D major prelude, the D minor prelude, they're all essentially exercises in keyboard technique. But the E-flat prelude is something different. This is a large-scale concert piece, modeled perhaps after 17th century preludia. After a somewhat free opening section in the prelude, complete with a big virtuosic run in the right hand to end it, we're led to a fugue. And in fact, this is what makes this prelude so special. It contains within it already a fugue, before we even get to the fugue of the Prelude and Fugue pair. This section of the prelude is written in what theorists of the time would have called the gebundene Stil, that is, the tied style. And the reason for that name comes obviously from the many, many tied voices that run through this fugue. But what do all of those ties accomplish? What's the reason for having these slowly moving, long-held notes? The reason behind all of these ties is to create dissonance, primarily through a technique known as suspension. So really briefly, for those who've never heard of this term before, a suspension is one of the primary ways that composers, really all through music history, have controlled dissonance. And a suspension always has three parts to it. It begins with a consonant preparation, leading to the dissonant suspension itself, and finally, the consonant resolution of the suspension. So let's see how this works in practice. We'll track some of these suspensions as they occur at the beginning of this section of the prelude. Bach begins with the subject, which, because it's by itself, unaccompanied by any other voices, is essentially consonant. But then Bach immediately, with the answer, brings in a bass note, F, which forms a dissonance with this upper note, E-flat. F to E-flat is the dissonant interval of a seventh. And so this is our first suspension, which resolves down by step in the upper voice to form a consonant third. And immediately after that, Bach follows it up with another suspension, this time in the bass. The bass holds its B-flat here, and the upper voice moves down to a C, forming the dissonant interval of a second, which is then resolved down by step to A-flat, forming the consonant interval of a third. So that's the pattern always in this piece. We have consonants leading to dissonant suspension, and finally a consonant resolution. Let's hear all of that again. A little bit later on in the piece, Bach ups the ante by actually using multiple suspensions at the same time. My favorite moment is very near this, the end of this section of the prelude, where Bach uses both a ninth and a seventh as dissonant suspensions at the same time. It sounds like this. So here we have the ninth down here, a ninth from A flat to B flat, and a seventh from A flat to G. And we put all that together and we get this, which resolves down to this. So if you recall, I described this as the tide style, which means that in fact all of these dissonant suspensions are tied over to their consonant preparations. On an instrument like the harpsichord, whose tone decays after time, it means that those dissonant suspensions end up not actually being that loud. That is, we might not hear the dissonance that Bach achieves. Personally, I think that on a good instrument in a good space, these tied over suspensions create a really fine effect, and there's really not much that we have to do to change that. But as a way of preparing to perform the piece, and as a way of learning to listen for all of these dissonances, I think we could do worse than follow some of the advice given by Frescobaldi in his first book of toccatas. What Frescobaldi suggests there is that when the player encounters dissonances and ties, the player should feel free to restrike all of those dissonances and tied notes as they see fit. And although Frescobaldi is certainly far removed from Bach, both in terms of time and geography, I think as advice for adapting keyboard music from one keyboard to another, it's really good advice. So I thought it would be interesting to see how this section of the prelude sounds with all of those dissonant suspensions restruck. And maybe we wouldn't want to perform it this way, but at least it's a good way of discovering for ourselves as players the effect of all of these harsh dissonant suspensions.